All right, good evening, everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. My name's Pauline Matindang Garcia. I am the Director of Care Transitions for Livingston Memorial, VNA and Hospice. This is the third session of our 5 Wishes webinar. I will be moderating this presentation, and Terry Helton will be presenting. Before we get started, I will go ahead and just discuss a few housekeeping notes like I did the last couple of weeks. So today's session is being recorded. Once again, it will be available for viewing after the presentation, and we will include a closed caption with that uploaded video. It will be available post-presentation. If you have any questions for Terry, please feel free to use the chat function on the Zoom box. It's located on the bottom of your screen. There's a chat icon. You're going to click on that, type your message, and don't forget to hit enter so you can send me a direct message to address any of your questions. We will do our very best to answer all of your questions during the presentation, and all of the question and answer will also be posted on the website. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to also send me a direct message so we can assist you with that. So without further ado, I am going to address Terry Helton.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Terry Helton, and it's good to see you, so to speak. I'm glad you're with us tonight, and we're going to talk about Wish 3. But before we do that, I always like to do a little review on what we talked about the last couple of weeks, why we're here. And so the 5 Wishes is an advanced directive. It's one form of an advanced healthcare directive. The others you can find at the state of California. You can find them on the Catholic Healthcare, the California Hospital Association website. You can also handwrite one, and we will talk more about what it needs to be a legal document on week 5. So come back for that. The other forms are some from Cottage Hospital, some from Stanford Letter Writing Project. So the form, again, is not what makes the biggest difference. The conversation that you have with your family, loved ones, is what's really important. So they remember what you've talked about, and that you have the document puts in writing what you have talked about. So we're going to proceed tonight. We talked last week about talking about life support treatments, and we went into detail about that. Tonight, we're going to talk about something a little better, a little different, and things that we may not share with our family that could be important to us. So I will get started. It is Wish 3, my wish for how comfortable I want to be. And that you will find on page 8 in this 5 Wishes handbook. We're going to stay on this single one page tonight, and we are only going to talk about Wish 3. So a truth in life. We start life and keep living, racing along with life and all it hands us. And sometimes we choose those things that we have in our hands. Like I've chosen to work with advanced care planning. I choose to be an active part of my congregation, my church. I have made choices in my life that I have really enjoyed and enjoy now, and choices I've regretted. So as I race along in life, I have chosen some of these things in my hands, and sometimes I have been handed things that were not my choice. So those are things that happen. We make plans throughout life for birthday parties. My birthday is tomorrow. I'll be 68. I claim it well. I earned every year of that. We have graduations. We plan for those. I've had 2 kids that have graduated from high school. I have kids that have graduated from college. We plan for marriage, and we often plan for having a family. But we don't plan on the illnesses, the aches and pains, and the multiple health problems along the way. I said I'm 68 tomorrow, and let me tell you, I am experiencing those things along the way that I had not expected. And in doing that, I have really grown some empathy for my mother, especially my mother. So just to let you know, there is always a sunny side to those aches and pains, but it hits us all. And essentially, every one of us experiences this, especially as we age. The hardest part is raising the subject, starting the conversation as we age, and hopefully when we're younger, starting this conversation. And we don't raise the subject because part of it is we don't know how to raise the subject. And the other thing is that we have fears that we may not identify ourselves. We may not even know we have those unspoken fears until we start talking about the subject. And the other is because we have some embarrassments in our life. So the concerns would be, next slide, please. Concerns, often we're afraid of being a burden. And if we go to talk about it, then that becomes an obvious thing that we may be a burden. And we may be concerned about what others think, including our own family and friends. We get concerned, what are they going to think if I talk about this? We may be afraid of embarrassing our family. I guarantee you there is nothing bad enough in talking about my choices at the end of life that can embarrass the family enough that they don't want to talk about it. And the other thing that we get concerned about and is hard is when we talk about these things, we actually sometimes talk about losing control in our lives. If I am not able to make decisions for myself medically, I've lost control. And believe me, that's a big thing. If I am not able to, say, stay in my home because I don't have the cognitive ability, the mental ability, maybe the financial ability, then that means I've lost control. So those are sometimes the obvious concerns, but we also have conscious and unconscious fears that we may not talk about and we may not recognize. And one of those being that if I talk about it, and we tend to think of this as a superstition, if I talk about it, it may happen. In fact, there was an incident this last week in the agency where we needed to have somebody come in a position, and the person who was hiring this person was kind of afraid to say the person's name for fear that it wasn't going to happen. And I have to admit, I've had those times in my life that if I talk about that, it's not real, it's not going to happen, it will disappear. So the opposite is true about advanced care planning. If I talk about this and I put down my choices, then unconsciously or consciously, I'm afraid they may happen. So that's a big part of planning and talking about this. So how we start is we start with an understanding. And this is actually, if you want to follow along, the other wasn't listed on here, but this is listed on here. The other is starting with an understanding. I understand my loved ones, friends, and healthcare providers may not be able to do some of the things you want them to do. And we're going to talk about that in a list. Or they may not, are not required by law to do some of those things that you're expecting or you would really like. So you understand that. But you also understand I don't wish to place new or added legal duties on my healthcare providers. I mean, there's a lot they already have to do. And you don't want to place those duties on them unless they're already there. So that leads to the last comment on this slide is, I also do not expect these wishes to excuse my healthcare providers from giving me proper care as required by law. So there's a balance here, and knowing those things is important. And that brings it back to the conversation that you should be having with your healthcare provider regarding your wishes. So always remember, and I mentioned this last week, but it's always important for your caregivers, the agent who's going to be your decision maker, to remember that individuals deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, especially when they are unable to speak for themselves. And the point of the document is your decisions are on this document, your wishes are on this document, and It becomes active when you cannot speak for yourself. So that agent needs to remember that and treat you with dignity and respect. And that following someone's wishes as they have shared them in a way is showing respect and dignity. Are there questions?
Yes, so Susan is asking, can you, what would be new? And I'm finding out, I'm trying to get more information on, more detail about her question.
That would be good. What she means by new. Consider my comfort in filling out this document. And this is itemized. And I do want to remind you that you can add to this document on a separate sheet of paper and initial it, or you can cross out the things you don't want. So talking about, I want to be free of pain as much as possible. And we covered this last week, that being free of pain as much as possible may mean that you are going to be drowsy and sleepy. It can even mean that you may not be quite rousable. So those are choices to discuss again with your family and friends and your healthcare providers. I want my caregivers or caregiver to help me if I show signs of depression. Often depression is something we don't recognize in ourselves, and other people sometimes have to help us understand that we may be depressed. If we are not as active as we were, if we are feeling extremely sad, if we're not eating as much, if we're eating more. So depression has different symptoms, and maybe if they can recognize that in you, then they can get treatment to help you feel better from that. Or if you have signs of nausea, and treatment needs to be done for that. Especially shortness of breath should be addressed. Maybe you need to have that visit from the doctor or with the doctor to get oxygen and have that in your home to help you with that shortness of breath, or do exercises that are calming and relaxing and can help you have a better breathing experience. Maybe you're having hallucinations and there's medications you need for that. So that caregiver should be able to recognize those things or grow to recognize those things and care to get you treated and to help you. There are other things. There might be other forms of suffering that you do not know how to express, but that caregiver could be close enough and understand you well enough that they would recognize that and get help for you. I want a cool, moist cloth put on my forehead if I have a fever. And I have to tell you, when I typed this, and I typed it, I'm going, okay, a cool cloth on my forehead. That would be a very comforting thing, but so maybe would some medication to bring down that fever if it's high enough. So, or maybe putting some nice cool lotion on could feel good. So any of those things could be in there. I want my lips and mouth kept moist. Boy, let me tell you, that is very important to some people. I wish to have warm baths often. And I find this interesting about the warm baths. When my father-in-law was in Northern California and he was in a nursing home towards the end of his life, his family was very private and very protective, and they didn't want anybody in there giving him a bath because of his privacy. And I happened to be a younger nurse at the time, and I was trying to help them understand he would be more comfortable if they could give him a bath. And so I will never forget the nursing administrator coming along and saying to the family in a very strong tone that we are going to give this gentleman a bath and his daughter-in-law is going to help. She will not see any of his private areas, but she is going to assist with this, and we guarantee he will be more comfortable and we will protect his privacy. And lo and behold, they let us do it, and he was much more comfortable. So those minor things that we think of that are nothing are really important to all of our care.
Gary, to address that question earlier, her question was from the previous slide, which is, what are the new legal requirements for medical staff?
Oh, those are changing all the time. So it would have to be one legal thing is, and I'm going to bring this up here, is they ought to be able to look at your 5 wishes, your advanced healthcare directive, and follow what your wishes are. So that's a legal requirement. That's not necessarily new. But since 2009, we've had this electronic pulse, we've had the pulse, and that also lists your wishes and is an actual physician order when it's completed correctly. So that is something they should be following if you had one of these. And this is something we can talk about at a later date. So well, for instance, I have an idea of one of those new legal things since 2016. And not every physician is required to do this. And we talked about the Dignity with Death Act last week. And so physicians are required to hear your request if you were to write a letter requesting to participate in the Death with Dignity Act, where you wanted to have assistance with the medication for taking your life. However, they are not required to be the prescriber of that medication. If you were to approach your physician and say you wanted to participate, then, and that physician did not want to be the physician to prescribe, then they would need to refer you to another physician for that. So that is a newer law, and I hope that's helpful. So I'm going to continue with considering my comfort. I wish to be kept fresh and clean at all times. It goes back to the story with my father-in-law, my dad. But I have a story with the next one, as I wish to be massaged with warm oils as often as I can be. Well, now I would not mind having massages and having warm oils. That could be very, very relaxing. But my beloved of 48 years would not like that. And he and I actually completed 5 wishes. We completed the document, and we had our documents notarized when we did our trust. We did them as a separate document. And when we did our trust, we had them notarized. And then my smart husband sent the documents, everything to our children in electronic format. And I was talking to my son and saying, what do you think? And he said, well, I see Dad does not want to have massages in oil, but you do. So I laugh about it, but it made me feel good that he actually went through the documents and we could talk about it. I wish to have my favorite music played when possible until my death. So that would be something to really have a conversation about. I wish to have personal care like shaving, nail clipping, teeth brushing, etc., as long as they don't cause me pain or suffering. And what would that be for you? That is something that you would need to have a conversation with, because I really want to have my teeth cleaned, but some people would think that's kind of painful if they're towards the end of life and they've had medication that causes your gums to be much more sensitive. So there are different choices of how to do this. I would tend to think I want to have all that cleaning done, but that's not for everybody, and there are personal choices. I wish to have religious readings and well-loved poems or books read aloud while I'm near death. Maybe you do, and maybe you don't. That would be something to have a discussion about. And finally, I wish to know about options for hospice care. And that is definitely a conversation to have with loved ones about, when would I want to know about hospice? When would hospice be appropriate for me if I were coming close to the end of life? What if I had an accident where I couldn't decide for myself, but I was going to be not dying in soon, but I couldn't survive for long? When would I want to have hospice care? Very important conversations. Hospice care is not part of making you die. It's not part of keeping you alive. Hospice care is support for an individual who you would not be surprised if they died in 6 months. So it's kind of odd to end with that, but if there are questions, I would be glad to answer them now. And if there aren't, that's okay too.
Give it a few minutes to give participants a chance to type their questions, or they can also unmute if they want to. If anyone wants to ask a question directly, feel free to unmute and ask Terry.
This is Nancy Borchard. I'm just wondering, I hear, and I've experienced with some more distant relatives about, it's always a dilemma, or not always, but often a dilemma about when to start hospice care. And it's, you know, so many people think that, oh, well, everyone thinks I'm dying now, so I guess I'm over. And I don't think I am, so I don't want to do that. And could you talk a little bit, and we hear about hospice care versus palliative care. And there is a little difference in that, I think. And could you just discuss that?
There is a little difference in that. Hospice, and I always go back to Medicare because a lot of what we provide in hospice is based on Medicare, and what we provide in palliative care is also based on Medicare. So hospice, often people think they have to be at the very end of their life, going to die within 2 weeks to be on hospice. And hospice is, you have to have a terminal diagnosis that you are actually dying to be on hospice. And there are many diagnoses. There's cancer, there's ALS, there's heart disease, there's dementia towards the end of dementia. But you may be within 6 months of dying. And I will tell you, I have cared for people when I was a hospice nurse that were on our care for over a year. And they lived a quality life while on hospice. As they were declining, they were allowed to stay on hospice beyond 6 months because they were showing decline. And it may have been very gradual decline, but it was decline. So the sooner somebody is on hospice, my belief, and it's my personal belief, it is better for the family, it's better for the patient because they receive the support of the hospice team. They receive the support of the nurses, the physician, the spiritual support people, the social workers, and those bathers, those caregiver bathers who come in and help with that. And I've heard families speak to this, that they were surprised at how much support hospice gave them, that they had not expected that. And then their family members on hospice, and they go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. And this has happened again and again and again. So I think that's important to know. Also, hospice provides medications for support of the patient while they're in the dying process. It provides the equipment they need, the bed, the wheelchair, the walker, oxygen supplies for those skin tears that may happen. If the person can't void, it supplies the equipment for that. It just is an amazing, amazing gift to families. Palliative care, I always say that hospice is always palliative care because in my terminology and thinking, palliative means to treat symptoms. So there's always symptom management. In palliative care, in the palliative care world, people may be discussing, and they should be discussing, life choices, especially when there's a chronic disease, that chronic disease is going to lead down a path towards end of life eventually. And the idea of palliative care is that those choices are, should I have this surgery? Does it benefit me? And will I have that surgery? Where hospice, we don't question if there's a surgery. We don't do lab tests for the most part. We don't do surgeries unless it's for a palliative, unless it's for a reason that person is in extreme pain, suffering, and that's very, very, very rare. Where in palliative care, we're looking towards end of life and symptom management, but we're also doing treatments along the way while we're receiving the support of spiritual care and hopefully social workers, and sometimes those bath givers. Does that answer your question clearly enough?
Yes, I think so.
Now, our next question, are there specific number of hours hospice care comes in each day?
Well, that's a really good question, because hospice, and hear me on this, hospice is available 24 hours a day. There is somebody on call to take your call and to answer questions. However, hospice does not have a person there 24 hours a day, because that would be cost prohibitive. It's just impossible related to costs. So I will give you an example. I had a patient who had made a choice not to have a valve replaced in her heart. And when she came on care, she was alert, oriented, walking. She lived in a residential area where an independent living, where she lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, cared for herself, did her own laundry, would go down to the assisted living area to have supper sometimes, would go out with her daughter and her friends. So pretty healthy, but she had made a decision about that valve. And I saw her maybe once every couple of weeks. And as time progressed, she became weaker. That heart valve was giving out, and I saw her once a week. And then I was the only one seeing her. And then the social worker came in, would see her maybe once a month. And then as time progressed, that valve became weaker and her heart became less strong, and she began to be short of breath. And so we brought in some oxygen, and then we talked about bringing in a bed so she could sleep elevated. And she didn't go down to outside anymore to have her dinners. She didn't really go out with her daughter. She really missed going to her dentist. And we began to talk about having one of the home health aides come in and help her, but she didn't really feel that need yet, but we wanted to get her introduced to it. So we had the home health aide come in and do a little bit of laundry for her and get introduced, because she was progressing towards that end of her life. And I was going probably twice a week. And then in a couple of weeks, I was going 3 times a week. And at the very end, I went every day. So that is what it looks like for time-wise. And when I went every day, I would spend time enough to assess her, to check her pain, check her breathing, to look on the medications, what she needed, to do education to the caregiver she had hired to stay there with her. And that time would probably be about a half hour to an hour. So I'm hoping that answers the question for you. Now I want to go back to the 24-hour call. If you call in and you have a question regarding my family member is in pain, or I'm going to say it, the catheter came out and it's hard, and they're in, the bed is wet and I don't know what to do, and I need you to come, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we will send somebody out at 2 in the morning. So that is the other end of that question. Somebody had their hand raised. I saw that.
I did.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, my name is Barb Gardner, and I was real surprised when my mom was dying that she shocked my sister and brother and me by saying she wanted to die alone. And my mom was a very social person. It wasn't like she was reclusive or shy. She was a leader. She was a very outgoing, wonderful person. And we respected her wishes, of course, but it was really shocking to us because it just seemed so counter to who she was in life. And so I'm wondering, is that a wish? I don't think I want that to happen to me, at least not at this point, but is that something we could put into our 5 wishes?
There is no reason why you couldn't put that in your 5 wishes if that were your choice. I
Okay.
might phrase it that I don't have to have somebody with me. It's a big deal for a lot of people to think we need somebody with us when we're dying.
Uh-huh.
And I have to say, I think my brother-in-law was sneaky. because I do. He died in January 2000, that Y2K period. And I had been in there sitting on the bed with him, and it was a queen size bed, and I'm sitting on the bed and he's laying down and I'm just there with him. And I get up to go to the bathroom. Sorry, I'm so public with everything. I get up and go, and I'm coming out and my husband said, Randy died. And I went, I was just in there. And so I think that Randy chose to die while nobody was in the room. And I know that has happened more than once. And I would say, I would look at your mom's life because she was very social. But were there other hints in her life that showed that she needed private time and personal time? So sometimes we social people are actually introverts and need to make up private time. And so that may have been a very private thing for her.
I think you're right. I mean, she lived alone for the last 40 years, well, 35 years of her life. And she was fiercely independent. So she was used to being alone, I think, a lot. But you reminded me of something else when you said your brother-in-law died in the few minutes you left the room. And that happened with my brother-in-law. My sister-in-law had 2 teenagers at the time, and they lived in a 2-story home in Vermont. And the hospice nurse said to my sister, run upstairs and wake up your kids. I think your husband's going to be dying any minute. And my sister ran upstairs, woke up her kids, and by the time they got down there, Dwight had died.
Yeah.
And the hospice nurse said the same thing you're saying. You know, he must have wanted to die alone.
Yeah,
So-
it happens more than people realize.
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much.
Oh,
So
you're very-
if someone wants to put this in, they could write it in.
You definitely could write it in. This is your document.
So we
But
just, like the 3 wishes, we could put it there if we wanted to.
you could put it under my wish. You may want to wait for week 5 because we're going to talk about my wish for what I want my loved ones to know.
Oh, okay.
And that would be a great place to put it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
We receive a couple more questions. The first one, I originally filled out the 5 wishes 17 years ago. If one of the witnesses has moved out of state or died, should I have it re-signed or redone?
17 years ago. So it took me 10 years to do my second advanced healthcare directive. I would say that 17 years, it's time for you to have more discussions, more conversation, and do a new one. That would be my suggestion.
The next question, am I correct in understanding that there are several companies that provide hospice care? Are they all nonprofit?
There are multiple companies that provide hospice care, and they seem to creep up everywhere. And it does not take as much laws. It doesn't take, there's not as many regulations covering hospice as there is home health or hospitals in order for a company to start. So as fast as they're popping up, sometimes they disappear. But to answer your question, they are all for-profit hospices except for Livingston. Livingston is the only nonprofit hospice in the county. And that's been true since 1982. Yes, part of the reason I like working for Livingston. Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions in the chat box unless anyone else would like to unmute and ask their questions directly.
If it's okay, I would just like to share something. And I really want to thank you for discussing the Dignity with Death Act. And the reason I asked that question is that my husband died 1.5 years ago. And within a very short period of time, he had a pain in his back in April. In May, it was so bad, we ended up in urgent care. the early part of June, he was diagnosed with cancer that was not curable, of unknown origin and inoperable.
Wow.
By the oncologist wanted to pursue further some immunological tests to see if they could target any of the genetic mutations that were causing the problem. It took a month to get that result back. And by that time, the cancer that in the early part of June, May, June, was throughout his abdomen and his lungs. It had gone to his brain. And one of the things, and so what ended up happening is that obviously things progressed, but on a Saturday, he and a friend of his were able to go on a motorcycle ride up the Grimes Canyon. And those of you who have driven know what that's like. It's crazy. And by the next day, the end of the next day, he was not thinking right. He, his fine motor skills were not good. He had a lot of crazy thoughts. And then the following day, we ended up in the ER. They did more tests and found that the cancer had gone to his brain. And from that point forward, he had no control of his bladder. And this is a man who all his life was very active. He was a scuba diver. He sailed, he surfed, he climbed mountains. And when we found out it went to his brain, he asked me, "What's next for me, euthanasia?"
Mhm.
And I said, "No, we don't do that for people." But having worked in veterinary medicine and having had many animals through the time that we were together, you know, we participated in that many times. And I had to ask the question because having to tell him, no, that's not something that we do, I have felt very, very bad about that. And I just needed to ask the question because I needed to understand and know what our options are. So anyway, I just wanted to share that so that you understood where I was coming from. And I appreciate your help.
Nancy, you didn't have to explain. I understand a lot of I get an understanding of a lot of the emotional pain behind that.
Yeah.
Part of what I didn't talk about, and it's because we haven't had this discussion in the advanced directives, but there has been a way that people, and people don't like this idea, but for centuries, people have approached death with the idea of, I'm not going to eat. And your husband's cancer, when it went to his brain, it was in his stomach. His appetite was probably nothing. He probably had a very poor appetite. So his body was already taking control of that idea of food being not a wonderful thing. And his brain was going to deplete the ability to swallow. And that would have been a natural course also for his body to not eat. And so when somebody is approaching end of life and their body is resistant to food, when we try to feed them, we actually cause more distress. It causes distress on the organs. It causes suffering. And so the body is created to naturally begin to not eat, and it is not painful. And the same is true for fluid. As he couldn't have the ability to swallow eventually, the fluid he wouldn't have been able to have the fluid without aspirating to his lungs. And it would also have been a burden on his body. And so dehydration that comes in this form is generally not painful. It actually produces some euphoria like drinking wine. The endorphins go to the brain. And if I always give the difference between, my daughter is a runner, and she ran a race in Michigan when she thought the weather wasn't as hot as it was, and she got dehydrated. And she ended up in the tent needing IV therapy, IV fluid. But what she experienced is what people are afraid of. She got the headache, she got nausea, she got muscle pain, she threw up, which made the muscle pain worse. So that's what people are afraid of in dehydration. That's a true dehydration that comes on because of exertion in the heat, sun. If you were to go backpacking or hiking and didn't have enough water, that's what you would experience. But when a person is at the end of life and their body is already saying, I can't handle this, we are actually causing more distress by pushing it on them instead of allowing them to have a natural dehydration, a natural lack of food. So I don't want you to feel, my hope is that you don't feel guilty, but I do understand this need to have somebody, you know, a resource for somebody to leave more quickly if they want to. There are two sides to that, but I need people to hear that the end of life with not eating and not having water is not as painful as people tend to think.
Well, I want to apologize because I forgot to tell you the end of the whole story.
Okay, now we're very,
Yeah, after we had that conversation about euthanasia, we signed up for hospice. The following day, he chose to end his life. And what I feel bad about is that there was no other peaceful, in my opinion, no other peaceful solution. Because it was just going to be a wasting away. And that is absolutely not the person that he was.
yeah.
And so I understand it. But I still feel bad that it couldn't have been peaceful because it was not peaceful.
Oh, I'm so
But-
sorry for that.
But on the other hand, my mom was in hospice care at the end of her life, and she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she survived 9 months. She didn't want to have any treatments, and she laughed because those months she only had one aspirin.
Wow.
And it, you know, and so that's that experience. And my father had a stroke, and you know, he was in a bed in the hospital, and you know, I felt bad for him too, because, but I will tell you, because of the conversations that he had with my brother and myself, he lived in North Carolina, and every time I went back to visit, he sat us down and he said, this is what I want. This is how I want you to take care of things. I don't want this, I want that. He made sure we knew everything. So when things came to a crisis, I have to tell you, we had a tremendous amount of strength in order to be able to do what he wanted to do. And if anybody's thinking that those conversations are difficult, yes, they are. But in the end, it gives the people that are left that have to make the choices power and strength that you can't even imagine. So-
Nancy, thank you. That is very true. And it's actually a very loving thing to do, to have those conversations. I do want to say, I want to go back to, I don't know when your husband did this, but I do want to say with the Death with Dignity Act that you can be on hospice when that act takes place. And that is actually very supportive to the family when they do it. And it can, if that is the choice of the person, can allow for a peaceful death.
I appreciate knowing that, because
Family.
that's kind of what I want for myself. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you for being so open and for the conversation.
Mhm.
I know it must be hard.
It kind of sounds trite sometimes, but it is better every day. So thank you.
It's a roller coaster ride.
Oh my God, yes.
It is. So I'm going to conclude here, and I do want to, I'm putting up this pink form, which is called a POLST, the Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, that we are thinking about doing this, whether it would be, and we would like you to email us in or let Linda know what the best would be to do it very soon after this presentation, or to put it off for a period of time. And it would be a one evening presentation. Thank you, and I will see you next week for how I want people to treat me.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this session. It will be uploaded onto our website in a couple of days. We'll see you
Thank
next week. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. Good job.